because of that, floaters. There's this disease called floaters, where like little pieces of your, right, come loose, and it's not cataract. I think cataract is different. Floaters and cataract are two different things.
Yes.
Yeah. So when in Tibetan, sometimes they translate it as cataract, but that's actually a different. Cataract, you don't have clear vision, apparently. Floater is when part of your internal, like there's liquid in your eyeball, and then if the skin like starts to loosen, it swims around in the liquid, and it gives you the appearance of hair-like lines. So the Tibetans talk about falling hair. Well, it makes sense due to gravity. It may actually look like something is falling down. So that's called floaters in English, and in Tibetan they use that as an example where the problem is with your eyes, and therefore you have a misperception. You have a wrong perception. And then this could also be because of the immediately preceding condition. If you get really angry, right, there's a lot of anger, and your blood pressure goes up, and you may see things as reddish. Because of the immediately preceding condition, you have like a red appearance because of your anger. Because of the blood, I don't know, whatever happens, you know, in your eyes, or I have no idea what exactly happens. But you may perceive colors, or because you're really upset, everything appears as grayish. Alright. Now these are explained here and don't need to be explained further. But now comes an explanation that is really not easy. Not easy, but very important. Why are they based on reality? Well, love is defined as an awareness that wishes for someone to be happy. That's the definition of love. The wish for a living being to be happy. Okay? And compassion is the wish for a living being to be free from suffering. So you can have love for yourself, feeling of closeness. Usually it's described as you have a feeling of closeness towards a certain person, with closeness also implying a sense of acceptance of negative qualities, weaknesses, etc. And then wishing that person to be happy, or in the case of compassion, having that feeling of closeness and wishing them to be free from suffering. Why? How is that based on reality? Well, because we want to be happy. Everyone deserves to be happy. So don't misunderstand karma. We're not saying because a person has created a karma to experience something, that doesn't mean they deserve it. No one deserves to suffer. It's like saying, well, you drank from the wrong tap, and now you're sick. You deserve to be sick. You made a mistake. You didn't do it with the intention to make yourself sick. You did it because you thought this is going to give you happiness. I mean, we make lots of mistakes all the time, thinking it gives us happiness, although in reality, it just creates more problems. And we're like that, and everyone else is like that. I mean, all other living beings, the mistakes we make is because we don't know any better. In the sense, like, we may know it's wrong, but there's this strong misperception. There's either a very strong emotion that is controlling us to such a degree we can't help it, or we actually believe it's going to give us happiness. Okay? So from a Buddhist point of view, therefore, there are no bad people. There are only
wrong.
Yeah, wrong. Basically, misperceiving, misapprehending people. So, therefore, love and compassion are based on reality in that everyone wants to be happy, no one wants to suffer, and just as I want to be happy and I do everything to be happy and not to suffer, well, everyone else deserves the same. That's reality. There's nothing wrong with that. So they were perfectly based on reality. We're dependent on each other. That's reality, interdependence. Whatever. My happiness actually depends on the happiness of others. Their well-being. If everyone gets sick around me, I want to have hummus next week. Right? Right? If everyone is unhappy and depressed and stops going to work, you can have thousands of shekel in your bank account. Hummus just won't be there. Right? So everything we enjoy right now, the clothing, having a warm room, the AC is okay, everything we enjoy is because of others, because they're well enough to do their job. And anyway, we're so dependent on others. At the beginning of our life, we're so dependent on others. At the end of our lives, we're very dependent on others. And what? In the middle of our life, we live a very selfish kind of existence? That doesn't make sense. We're very dependent on others. Everything we know is because of others. You couldn't even write your name if it wasn't for others. You were not born with a pencil in your hand kind of writing away. Like really, everything we take for granted, it's because of others. Everything. Right? Everything we've achieved, like look at a baby, you can't even turn around. Like, babies are lying on their back and they can't really go. That's what we were like at some point. And we've learned from others and other living beings. So to be selfish doesn't make sense, actually. To be loving totally makes sense. To be kind, to be compassionate, to consider others' happiness as important as my own, makes sense because it is as important as my own. Because it's dependent. My happiness is dependent on the happiness of others. Because we're all connected. Right? If we really allow this to sink deeper, then hatred, etc., and aversion, they just harm us and don't bring any benefit. That doesn't mean we cannot be strong. It's not okay. Think of the Dalai Lama. Right? You can be strong, you can be assertive. Anyway, so that's important to understand, and just intellectual understanding doesn't help. It has to come from within. And it's like once you understand jogging is good for you, can't wait until you start jogging. Once you understand love and compassion are good for you, you can't wait until you can apply it. Alright. But now the next part is the category of conceptual and non-conceptual consciousness. And that is hard. It's not that easy, but extremely important. Now, when we say when we say mental consciousness, our mental consciousnesses are mostly conceptual. Mostly conceptual.
I just want to ask the translation to Hebrew about
Ah, yeah.
conception.
What is conceptual in Hebrew? Mustagi. So this is a little difficult, but you all understand this, actually. It's just a way in which this is explained that we may not be familiar with. What does that mean? That every time you perceive something with your mental consciousness, you don't perceive it directly. Okay, like it's very easy for you to understand this. If you look at the altar, you perceive the altar directly, right? With the background, all the colors, everything that's in the sphere of your vision, even though you're not aware of it, it's part of the picture. Okay. Now if I ask you to close your eyes and think of the altar, it still appears. But something is missing. What's missing? The vividness. The vividness is missing. So, the vividness in Hebrew, what's vividness? Chayut.
Vitality.
Vitality, okay.
Also the details.
Pardon?
Details. All
The details, very good. The details, they're missing. The details are missing. The vividness is missing. What else is missing?
Some like sensation that it's happening now. I don't know if I can.
Okay, the sense that is happening right now. Although if you think about the altar, there's a sense it's right there. Okay? Anyway, I'm not saying anything is missing, but maybe you can come up with something more. Just for you to, I want you to recognize the difference between sitting in front of your breakfast, for instance, and now thinking of your breakfast. Right? When you set it right in front of you, it was vividly there, with all the details. Okay? It was right there in front of you. Yeah, it was definitely a sense of being there in the presence. While if you now think about it, you know, of course, it's not there right now. And what happens is it appears to you in a way in which your mind just eliminates anything that does not have the main characteristics of that breakfast. If you look at your own breakfast, if you think of let's take your own breakfast like you had a plate of, I don't know, whatever, a piece of bread. Now, it has so many characteristics, right? This piece of bread, it has different holes in it and different size holes, and it's so complicated. But what makes it bread? The main characteristics are only quite few, right? What makes it bread? What makes it that breakfast bread? So you, in order to understand that this is your bread, you don't need to eliminate the absence of all these holes, for instance, right? Because those are just minor details, minor characteristics. The main characteristics, to be able to think of the bread this morning, you just take to mind the major characteristics that make that a piece of bread. So you're missing all the details. Why? Because you don't need to take all the details to mind. It would take you too long. All you do is take the basic kind of details. And the way your mind does this is by eliminating anything that is not that detail. Right? A certain shape, etc. And it's like, there's an image therefore. This is called a generic image. Some generic idea of what you think of as being your breakfast. Your personal sense of your breakfast. It's not the actual object. It's a creation of your mind, possible because of your memory of this breakfast. And our mental consciousness does this with everything. We have no direct perception of the object mentally. How could you? How could you? Because it doesn't depend on the sense powers, that is on the eye, sense power, etc. So our mental consciousness can only take to mind which was previously perceived by a sense consciousness, or what we come up with because we want to think about something specific, like friendship, for instance. So there's no external input that allows us to directly perceive the object. It's always through this image, through this idea we have. Does that make sense? So when you think of a piece of music, like you keep all day long, the song is playing in your mind. It's not an actual song, it's just a representation of this song. And so it's this generic image. If something needs to appear to you, if always something appears to you, what appears to you in the case of a conceptual mind is that generic image, is that representation of the object you're trying to get at. Because you don't have it right in front of you. Even if you did, the mental consciousness cannot connect with what is outside of you. Only the sense consciousnesses can do that. Only they can have their object appear as a reflection of what is in front of you. Okay? So here the mind needs to create something. In a sense, like a part of the mind, a part of a sense, what you associate with this object, that has to appear. Okay, so therefore it's not a direct mind, it's indirect. It's by way, through this image, that you can perceive an object. And that is very hard to recognize. It takes some time, we're not used to it. But there is a magazine called Scientific American Mind. I may have it actually with me, that article. And it's very interesting, they have an article on this. It's one of the older versions from like 2007, I believe, so 2007 or 8. In one of those magazines, I used to have a subscription of it, and in one of those, it talks about exactly that phenomenon. Taking the breakfast table, how a group of people had been asked to think about their breakfast. So memory, this is a mental consciousness. Memory can only take place on a mental level, and so it's a conceptual mind. And they recognized there was an image. And that everyone had a slightly different image. When they described that table, even though they sat on the same table, there was a slightly different perception of that. So you can therefore tell that any mental awareness is always mixed with our sense of what the object is. You can't help it. And as we've already heard, even the sense consciousnesses are influenced by our mental consciousnesses. Well, it becomes pretty obvious how whatever we perceive, there is already something there that allows us to perceive it that way. So it's always subjective. And there are lots of documentaries that suggest the same thing, that when we go somewhere, we perceive a tree, for instance, it's because there is already a preconception of a tree, there's already a conceptual understanding that then allows us to see the object, and we believe that's how it really exists because it's in front of us, but actually it's influenced completely by our conceptual image of that object. There's a lot of scientific evidence that supports that. So the fact that things, what we perceive as totally subjective, is very much supported by that. Alright, now, having said this, here what I've said, and this part, I just want to make sure that this is understood, so I'll read this part here. So the difference between conceptual, this is page 19. So all our mental consciousnesses, there are very few that are not conceptual. An exception is a dream mind. Some dream minds can be direct perceptions, but they don't have to be. And we cannot control. This has nothing to do with lucid dreaming, and it doesn't matter. Some of them may be direct, and some of them may not be. But all our awakened state, all our mental consciousnesses are always conceptual. So the mind that meditates is conceptual. The mind that thinks about, analyzes things all day long, plans ahead, worries, all conceptual. Alright, so let's look therefore at what does this mind do. The difference between conceptual and non-conceptual awarenesses is that conceptual awarenesses do not perceive their objects of engagement, their main objects, directly, whereas non-conceptual awarenesses do. So directly, what does it mean, directly?
Sense like this.
Via another object or without another object. So via, directly means you don't need anything else, you just get at the object in a straightforward way. While with a conceptual mind, you can only get at the object via this image you have of the object. Conceptual consciousnesses are necessarily mental consciousnesses, and never sense consciousnesses. Sense consciousnesses can only be direct. That apprehend their object of engagement indirectly by way of a generic image, by way of a generic representation of what the object means to you. I ask you to think of a car. What happens? A car appears. What color is that car? Some have a color, some say blue, right? In my case it would be red. And everyone has a different, right? Even the color, it's totally individually different. Maybe it's the color of your car, or what you associated with car in general. It even comes with a color. And for some of us, there's no color, right? It's not necessary, because when it appears, the main features that you associate with the car, they appear and the color is not necessary. Okay? Movies depict this generic image. In a movie, this generic image is depicted. For instance, in the movie, when they show someone remembering something, have you ever noticed how they show remembrance, like another person who's remembering something, and you always know, because either that memory is black and white, or it's fuzzy. So that's again the same as with the conceptual consciousness, because it's not as clear, as vivid, and as detailed as the actual experience, right? So with memory, they only do that for memory. Or if you imagine something, if you visualize or imagine something, in that case, they would also depict it that way. So it's actually, if you have a hard time understanding a conceptual mind, just think of how it's depicted in a movie. Black and white. It lacks the vividness. Or sometimes the edges are very fuzzy. Because again, it's not as clear and vivid, and it's like kind of clear, kind of not clear. Well, because our mind just takes on the main aspects and forgets the details. Doesn't need the details. When we think about a visual object, such as a car that is not nearby, so that we cannot perceive it with any of our sense consciousnesses. Of course, if you have a car in front of you, you may as well look at it and think about that. But if you don't, then to that conceptual consciousness, thinking of the car, a generic or mental image of the car appears. Similarly, when we think about a song, a generic image of the song appears. When we think about the smell of a perfume, a generic image of the smell of the perfume appears. And there have been tests done. Parts of your brain that are associated with perceiving the object, they're also activated. Right? So it's not exactly, it doesn't have the same quality, but it also shows when another person tells us about something, we take that to mind, and an image, a generic image of that appears, and the same parts of the brain are activated. So we don't even know where, we're so engrossed in the story, but when you think about it, it appears. A generic image that is a representation of the object appears, which in that case, a similar aspect of the brain is highlighted or gets active. That would be active when you actually perceive the thing. When another person tells you about it, you take it in, you think about it, and there's also a conceptual mind. Again, that part of the brain activated that is responsible for doing the thing. Okay? So, you can think of food. I mean, just if I ask you, think of the taste of hummus. You can do it, right? Kind of, yeah. I can't do it as well as with a car, because our eye consciousness is so dominant that it's easier for us to visualize shape and color than to visualize sound, or even harder, taste, and maybe cold, for instance. Visualize cold. You can to some degree, but it's the generic image here of what you mean cold to be. Okay? So, when we think about chocolate, a generic image of chocolate appears. When we think about smoothness, a generic image, etc. So all that appears. The generic image, in the case of the car, is only a representation of the car, not the car itself. Right? When you perceive the car, then the car itself is reflected. While if you think about a car, that is just your personal representation, your personal sense of a car. It serves as an intermediary object that allows the conceptual consciousness to get at the car. Without that, you wouldn't be able to perceive car, because something needs to appear. The generic image is a subjective representation of the car, in that it encompasses what we mean when we say car. And that's different for everyone. Our representation of the car is not directly connected to reality, for it is constructed by labels and concepts. Right? By labels and concepts. On the basis of the parts of the car, such as the tires, the windshield, the engine, the steering wheel, etc., assembled in a specific way and able to perform a specific function, we constructed a mental concept of the car that does not exist from the side of the car itself, but is part of our conceptually labeling car. So we need to have labeled car, have already some understanding, have thought car, have at some point recognized the car, and then after that, it is then possible for us to think, oh, car, or this, that, and the other. All right? So it could be a mental image can be either the word. The word is described as a sound generality, right? A sound, as in like the word or sound generality. So a word generality, if you like. When you think car, and what appears is the word car. Does that happen to you?
Yes.
Right, okay. Now, or if I say friendship, for instance. Car, it is more likely when we think of a car, it is more likely that an actual image of the car appears. But when I say friendship, that's a lot more complicated. It's not like a blue thing appears that's called friendship. So it's oftentimes the word that appears, friendship. Okay? But it could also be both your sense of friendship and the word mixed. Or with a car, the same thing. The word car appears, that generality of the word car, plus your image of the car. They could appear both. Okay? So that accounts for also like us thinking in a certain language. If you think in a language, every time you think there is that generic image, but it's very hard to recognize it. It's not easy to recognize it. So that's why we explained this first, and then slowly you learn to recognize, in certain situations you can recognize the image. It's easiest if the image is visual. Okay? Then you're aware, blue or whatever. It's easy in that case. Now why are we taught this? Well, because this mind is mistaken. Because it seems to be the actual thing, but it's not the actual thing. That's important to understand. So we think we're getting at the object, and we are. In terms of mental, it's great. We can think about anything, but there's always a limitation. We're never actually getting at the object as really exists, because it's always a subjective creation of our own mind. It's always this, and to the mind, that thing, which is just a creation of the mind, appears to be the actual thing. So that's where the mistake lies. Okay? Doesn't matter, it's not a big deal, but we still need to know that any perception we have of reality, it could be better than that. And through meditation, you can actually transform a mental consciousness that is conceptual into a non-conceptual consciousness, a direct perception. But that's really difficult. Really difficult. It requires a lot of practice to have a direct experience of objects. Right? Okay. But first, before we can do that, therefore, we need to understand this representation, this generic image. So this constructed representation or generic image of the car enables the conceptual awareness to apprehend the car. Without the appearance of the generic image of the car, the conceptual consciousness would not be able to think about the car, since it does not function like a sense consciousness to which an actual car nakedly appears. Without that image. Nakedly. They use the word nakedly. Okay. All right. So I hope this is clear. And what is so important, I think, also, because we have general images, this is where generalization comes in. You're familiar with this word generalization, right? So, what is an example of an extreme form of generalization?
Racism.
Very good. Racism. That's it. Racism. Oh, if they have this color of skin, or that religion, or that cultural background, or whatever, right? Then they are like that. So we have this general image, we see possibly a characteristic in one person, right? Maybe, I don't know, whatever is the characteristic. And then every person who looks similar, or has a similar background, whatever the reason for us thinking that, we associate that person with that characteristic, which could be totally unrelated. But we have this general image again, this notion, oh, this person has this and this background. So we just generalize because we have a generic image, and every time we think of this person, this kind of generic image appears of that kind of characteristic. And oftentimes it happens with one person. One person thinking, oh, he or she is like that. We had that thought before. We have a generic image of them. And although the person is changing all the time, in our mind, they're kind of stuck in that image. That's how we think of them. So that's the image we have of that person. And that image is permanent. In that, it's not constantly changing. It's not constantly changing. It may change over time, but it's not constantly changing, that's for sure. Right? And we mistake our view of things to be reality. Because, of course, it is close to, it can be close to reality. It can be totally wrong, but it can also be close enough. But it's never the actual thing. You just raised your hand?
Yeah, I just have one thing I thought about when you talked about it, that you have this expression that I know someone like the back of my hand, and I remember that this week I noticed a new small freckle on my hand, and I don't even know the back of my hand. Saying
you found a new freckle. Right. Well, we think that, yeah, I know this like the back of my hand, but you're right, we don't even know. I mean, forget about, even if you look at the back of your hand long enough, I mean, how much do you miss out because you don't have microscopic vision, basically. So, yeah, these ideas, how much do we really know? We know very little about things. Okay, but we may think we know so much about it. Okay. So, therefore, what I said before, they're actually mistaken awarenesses, but they are vital. So they're mistaken from the point of view, not just the appearance of inherent existence, that is also part of it. But even without that, even that wasn't there, hypothetically, even if it wasn't there, the image itself still appears to be the actual thing. So in that sense, it's mistaken. But it's very helpful. A conceptual mind, however limited it is right now, and we can get rid of a conceptual mind and replace it with direct perception, but that's difficult. So in the meantime, it's very helpful. It allows us to do so many different things with this mind. It's the mind that classifies, that labels, that reflects, that thinks about things. And as ordinary beings, it's the most helpful thing we have. But it's limited. It's limited. So sometimes people ask me, how can we attain the mind of a Buddha, actually?